Barakatah Yahweh, Barakatah Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Barakaha Kodash, Barakatum. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, glory, and infinite honors to Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. Double honors to the apostles and elders, a great millstone who ruled and teach well. And peace and salutations to you sincere Akim out there, pushing this word in truth and sincerity to the four corners of the globe. May you brothers endure until the end. This is the brother Ra'aya with another video. And in this video, I'll be profiling a clip from RT America's YouTube page titled Mass Graves of Indigenous Children Lead to Calls for Probe. And those indigenous children are speaking of the so-called Native Americans or Gadites of the Northern Kingdom. And as we'll see in this video, hey, we usually get on the atrocities that these Edomites, or so-called white people, have done to the Southern Kingdom, or the so-called Negroes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. But hey, just as many bad things have happened to the Northern Kingdom, or the so-called Native Americans and Latinos, showing that we are the Israelites under these curses, being oppressed by our enemies. And I find it interesting that this report recently came out, because what did you have last week? The anniversary of the Tulsa, Oklahoma Black Wall Street race riots, where those Edomites destroyed Black Wall Street. And this is just another example of the Edomites' perpetual hatred towards the children of Israel, because our forefather Jacob got the blessing and the birthright to the kingdom of heaven from their forefather Esau, and nothing will ever change. They will continue to have this perpetual hatred, even when we have them as our slaves in the kingdom of heaven. So what I'm telling you, sincere Akim out there, and you should already know this by now, is that we don't expect reparations on this side. We have the patience and the faith of the saints that if we endure all the hardships we're going through on this side, that will be of that elect number, that first fruits in the kingdom of heaven, getting our reparations, getting you heathen nations, chiefly you Edomites, under our subjection as our slaves, building up the kingdom of heaven, and get to give you back everything you gave to us on this side, from the Tulsa, Oklahoma Black Wall Street race riots to the deaths of these indigenous children up in Canada, these Gadites. But without further ado, let's play this clip.
The discovery of the remains of 215 Native children in British Columbia, Canada, has actually led to calls to further investigate atrocities committed against Indigenous communities across the country there. RT's Alex Mihailovich has that story.
It's a part of Canada's history that for the most part has been ignored.
My mom and dad went here. They were abused, they were starved, beaten and everything. My mom...
Like her parents, this woman is a survivor of Canada's residential school system. And like thousands of other Indigenous Canadians, as a child, she was ripped out of her home and forced to attend a residential school. Government-sanctioned facilities that were operated primarily by the Catholic, Anglican, and Protestant churches.
Oh, what a coincidence. These oppressive centers, these re-education camps run by so-called good white Christians. Hey, you Edomite Christians are some of the most barbaric, horrific mass murderers that history has ever seen. And the brother in the London camp has been doing a series on you so-called Edomite Christians and all the atrocities you've been committing. One video I saw was the Magdalene laundries over in I believe it was Ireland, how mass graves of women and children were found, because a lot of those women were single mothers that got sent to those laundries run by the nuns in the Catholic Church, and they abused those women and worked them to death. And as we'll see from these re-education schools, they abused these children, and a lot of children died. A lot of Gadite Israelite children, hence the mass graves being found. And you Edomite Christians of all bastard denominations have a lot of nerve coming to the Hebrew Israelites and talking shit about us. Especially you, Vocab Malone. You try to paint this narrative that we're the worst thing going around. But tell me, have the Hebrew Israelites went into other lands and colonized entire continents and killed off millions of people, stolen people's identities, given them poisonous food and water to eat and drink, or anything like that? Of course not.
From the 1800s, up to the late 1970s.
All the way up to the late 1970s, so fairly recently, with these Gadite children being abused by you so-called good Edomite Christians.
To this day, I still don't know why we were taken away. I thought they were bringing us to see our mom and dad.
More than 150,000 First Nations children were required to attend the federally funded church-run schools, with the goal of assimilating them into Canadian society. Once there, they were forced to convert to Christianity and not allowed to speak their native tongues. Upwards of 6,000 Indigenous children are believed to have died at the schools, most often due to disease, abuse, and neglect. In 2015, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded that the country's federal government had committed cultural genocide through the system, which included 130 schools across the nation. Last week, it was announced that a mass
trying to cut them off from their identity, which is exactly what these heathen nations have been doing to the nation of Israel to keep us away from our power, because they know that when we're away from our true identity, knowing that we're Israelites, that they can do whatever they want to us. This is Psalms chapter 83. I'm going to start at verse 1. And the header of the chapter reads, God implored to confound his enemies, you heathen nations. A song or psalm of Asaph. Keep not thou silence, O power. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O power. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, the true children of Israel, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. And like I just said, these heathen nations, at least right now, the top elites of these different heathen nations know that we are the true children of Israel, and they know that if they take us away from our power and we call ourselves so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, African American, Black, Mexican, Cherokee, Choctaw, Baptist, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, American, etc., that our power won't be near to us and they'll be able to do whatever they can to us. You can read further about that in the book of Judith in the Apocrypha, chapter 15. And while these Gadites that have been abused weren't referring to themselves as Israelites, hey, they followed a lot of the customs of the Israelites, and they were in a much better case than when they were ripped from their families and re-educated with bastard Edomite Christianity. And even though they were going off on a lot of things, those Gadites were real close to the customs of Israel. Some Gadites called their power Yohiwa and Yohiwashi, and we know the true names of the Most High and His Son are Yahweh and Yahweh. They wore the fringes and they kept the land Sabbaths, among many other customs that went back to their forefathers in Israel. Too close for comfort for the Edomites in the know. They had to do everything they could to completely erase any trace to them being Israelites. Hey, on the Jewish Encyclopedia website, Arsareth in 2nd Esdras chapter 13, where it said the 12 tribes went to, was referred to by them as America today. And also you had a Scottish so-called white man who could have been an Edomite named James Adair, who lived amongst the Gadites and said without a shadow of a doubt they were of the 10 tribes of Israel. Verse 6, the heathen nations that have confederated themselves against the nation of Israel to cut us off from being a people and keep us as far away from our power as they could, so they could abuse us in any way they want. The tabernacles of Edom, you so-called white people, and the Ishmaelites, the so-called Arabs, of Moab, or the so-called Chinese, and the Hagarenes, Gabal and Ammon, the so-called Japanese, and Amalek, another tribe of the Edomites, the 1948ers today. So the Edomites are mentioned twice as being confederated against the nation of Israel. You're the double enemy of the Most High. That's why you're going to get the worst when you're our slaves in the kingdom of heaven. the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre, the so-called Africans who are Hamites. And real quick, just to make a quick correction, I meant Judith chapter 5 instead of 15 in the Apocrypha. Let's get back to that video.
This grave was found with the remains of 215 Native children near this building in Kamloops, British Columbia, which used to be the largest residential school in Canada, with nearly 500 students enrolled at a time. The bodies of children found at the site were as young as 3 years old. The discovery saddened local residents, even though some say they are not shocked by the findings.
This has been covered up by the Roman Catholic Church. They don't want to acknowledge it. The Canadian government speaks as little as possible about it. But these rumors have been coming out for at least a decade.
Now many say the atrocities committed by the Canadian government have to be addressed properly. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he agrees with that sentiment.
I know that this tragedy is all too believable, but the pain is all too real. To truly heal these wounds, we must first acknowledge the truth. And not only about residential schools, but about so many injustices, both past and present, that Indigenous peoples face.
And that cuck Edomite, Justin Trudeau, just like all these other Edomite leaders and the average everyday Edomite, don't care about the plight of you Israelites. It's all just crocodile tears and BS trying to sweep things under the rug.
Wait.
When there was the remembrance of the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riots the other week, what did you see? A bunch of Edomites giving lip service, but when it came to reparations or the children of them paying for their forefathers, they were tight-lipped about it and said everything should just be forgotten and it was in the past. Well, that's not how the scriptures work. As we're going to get into later, there is a recompense coming to you Edomites for what your forefathers did, because reincarnation is biblical and you are your forefathers, so you still have to pay that tab for what you did in the past life and in this life. And it's a tab that all you Edomites across the planet have built up so much that you won't be able to pay back, but with your blood, sweat, and tears, like the children of Israel did under your captivity.
You scroll away. You need to hear this.
An ad.
Republicans across the country are moving.
Trudeau has told a coalition of Indigenous rights groups that his government has created a plan to help remedy generations of racial discrimination against the country's Indigenous population. However, not everyone is buying it, including Canadian New Democratic Party leader Jagmeet Singh, who is blaming the government for fighting First Nations people in court over the issue of residential schools instead of working with Indigenous communities to find a way to heal.
We are calling on the federal government to do something concrete. The Liberal government can't, on one hand, grieve this horrible tragedy, this horrible loss, while they are still taking Indigenous kids to court, while they're still taking survivors of residential schools to court.
There are currently calls across Canada to investigate the sites of other residential schools where many more Indigenous children are believed to be buried in mass graves. For RT, I'm Alex Mihailovich.
All right, here to discuss former UK MP George Galloway. So, George, for more than a...
And real quick, this is kind of off topic, but I believe this man, George Galloway, who I believe is Scottish, is an Israelite foreigner who happens to just look like an Edomite or a so-called white person. Because a lot of things he says makes him seem sincere to the plight of what has happened to people, and Israelites in the past, by the other people that look like him, who are truly Edomites, who truly have that perpetual hatred towards the children of Israel and feel no sympathy towards what their forefathers have done to the Israelites in the past and what they do to them today.
A century in Canada, these Indigenous children's boarding schools operated. The last one didn't close until the late 1970s. The monarch of England was considered the head of state at that time. Do you believe the Queen was aware of the abuses happening at these schools? And what has she said of this gruesome discovery?
Well, I can answer the second part of that question. Precisely nothing has been said by the...
And best believe the Queen of England or the other royalty don't care about the plight of what has been happening to so-called people of color. Hey, you saw what happened with that whole situation with the Prince and Meghan Markle, where they said they heard racial comments towards their brown skin looking baby. And then there have been reports coming out saying that it's certain jobs, whether clerical or other jobs going on at the palace, people of color weren't allowed to get them. Only Edomites were allowed to get those jobs.
British state, the monarchy, or for that matter, the mass media. These are shocking facts that you have reported, but I'm afraid they're not surprising. And if they were reported, they wouldn't surprise many. Our colonialists wiped out every single person that they found on the island of Tasmania, just in the Australasian part of the British Empire. Every last Tasmanian was wiped out. The treatment of the Aboriginal people in Australia, in New Zealand to a slightly lesser extent, is quite well known, and nobody would be shocked to learn that as late as the 1970s, this cultural genocide of which Trudeau speaks was still being practiced, because these are the bitter fruits of racism, which both fueled colonialism and provided the justification for colonialism. Because if you were not superior to other people, how could you?
But you Edomites aren't superior, you're inferior, especially to the children of Israel. And you Edomites are actually the basest of the heathen nations at dead bottom. Leprous dogs.
You justify invading their countries and stealing it from them. And the bitter fruits of racism is what has been taken from the ground, along with the corpses of these children. It is deeply shocking, but it's not at all surprising. And don't even ask me to go into what happened to the original people of what is now the United States of America. Perhaps 100 million people were destroyed in the colonial conquest of what is now the USA.
100 million of the Northern Kingdom. Hey, and it's been stated that 100 million of the Southern Kingdom, brought from the west coasts of Africa to the Americas, perished in the transatlantic slave trade. So you got about 200 million people right there, 200 million Israelite deaths that can be attributed to you so-called white good Christians, the biggest mass murderers and frauds and hypocrites and devils on the face of the earth.
Yes, absolutely, on all fronts of that. We know that this is directly in line with not only British colonialism, but modern American colonialism as well. And apart from these children who they say mysteriously died at these schools, most of which were operated by the Catholic or Anglican Church, by the way.
Edomites.
Those who lived through these programs described them more akin to a re-education camp where their native language and their culture was strictly prohibited. They were verbally and physically abused, these kids. They were told they were less than their white counterparts at the other schools outside of those walls. Christianity was forced upon them. Could one liken this to...
They have confederated themselves against us. Come, we shall cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel shall be no more remembered. And like I just said, while the Gadites weren't calling themselves Israelites, they were still following after some of the customs, which was damn near closer than to what happened to them after that little bit was stripped from them by these Edomites, and they were given Edomite bastard Christianity.
The Crusades of the 19th century then.
Yes, and this lasted until very recently, if not still being the case. I was, in my Catholic childhood, encouraged to give a penny for the black babies of Africa. You put the penny in their hand, and the hand went up and into their mouth. And the avowed purpose of this was to save a baby from purgatory. I can still remember how frightening that word purgatory was to me then, indeed to some extent now. This is the colonial mentality operating through the religious orders and
the Edomite mentality of Edomite supremacy.
The religious faiths. The idea that if I didn't give a penny, that God would allow a black baby in Africa to float around forever between heaven and hell. How cruel is that? How racist is that?
And that's all bullshit. Purgatory isn't biblical and hell isn't biblical. Hey, you Edomite Christians, 2/3 of the nation of Israel who don't know a damn thing about the Bible, and everybody else just needs to sit your ass down and listen to the true teachers, the true prophets of the Most High, chiefly through GMS or Great Millstone, because as we can clearly see, you just don't have it, and all this filth and madness you've been pushing over these hundreds of years has just completely bugged people out and made things much worse.
And of course, it raised a lot of pennies. Maybe that's what it was about, Manila.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it was about. He said it was to raise a bunch of pennies, to make money, because Christianity, Edomite Christianity, Roman Catholicism, or any of these other bastard offshoots are nothing more than a racket to make money.
And lastly, George, how should Canada, and by extension of this, England, make it right?
Well, an apology is the beginning, but it cannot be the end. The indigenous people, such as those have survived, would be entitled to be skeptical about an apology in 2021 for things that were happening for a century until the 1970s, but it is a necessary but not sufficient step. Proper compensation, reparation, and cultural reinstatement into the narrative of the history of Canada and indeed other countries is a must. The fact that we stole their land from them, that we killed them or tortured them in the form of this cultural genocide has to be front and center of every child's education in these former colonies, because to do otherwise is to add insult to the injury that these poor babies have suffered.
Absolutely. We'll leave it right there. George Galloway, always appreciate your insight. Thank you.
And the only way these Edomites in Canada, England, America, or anywhere else can make it right, the only reparations they can give is their blood, sweat, and tears during hardcore bondage and slavery in the kingdom of heaven, which is quickly coming. Hey, you Edomites are on your last leg. Your kingdom is about to collapse, and you're about to get everything that you dished out back unto you, double by those people you oppressed and said were inferior to you, so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, the children of Israel, and Gad, along with the other tribes, beginning with the elect, are going to get their payback on you. Let's get into some precepts. This is Genesis chapter 49. I'm going to read verse 18 to 19. I have waited for thy salvation, O Yahweh, and the elect of the nation of Israel, the 144,000 and the rest of the righteous 1/3 from all 12 tribes have been diligently waiting for the salvation of Yahweh Bahashem Yahweh Shai, the faith and the patience of the saints, that if we do everything we can to stay in the good graces of our power, we'll be of that elect number and be the first fruits in the kingdom of heaven, the first to get our hands on you heathen nations, chiefly you devils, you Edomites, Gad, the so-called Native Americans. A troop shall overcome him, a troop of those European Edomite colonizers, the Spanish, the French, the English, to the Americans, the American cavalry during the Indian Wars overcame Gad and took their land and enslaved them and raped, robbed, and murdered them. And we saw a recent example of that with those re-education schools in Canada. But he shall overcome at the last, beginning with the elect Gadites, getting you heathen nations, chiefly you Edomites of that troop that overcame them, back in the kingdom of heaven. This is Revelation chapter 13, verses 9 through 10. And this is in the New Testament. So you wacky-tacky Christians can't say that all this judgment and punishment for the enemies of Israel was only in the Old Testament. If any man have an ear, let him hear, those that have waited for the salvation of Yahweh Bahashem Yahweh Shai. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. the transatlantic slave trade, with the Southern Kingdom, or the so-called Negroes, being brought from the west coast of Africa to the Americas to serve in slavery, and in the Americas, you European Edomite colonizers taking away the lands of the so-called Native Americans and Latinos of the northern tribes of the nation of Israel, and enslaving them and abusing them all the way up until this day. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. And what was it said? What did George Galloway said? About 100 million Gadites were killed in the Americas. And like I said, about 100 million of the Southern Kingdom died on the way to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. And then you had Israelites dying during slavery, during colonialism, during the Reconstruction era, during the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights era, the War on Drugs era, all the way up until today, with Planned Parenthood in our neighborhoods to advocate for our women to get abortions, poisonous food and water put into our communities for our people to eat and drink, and all these poisonous ideologies like rap culture, black culture, thug culture, or whatever else they push on us to take us away from our power and to turn us into brute beasts and to kill each other. You Edomites have built up a tab which you cannot pay back. That's why you're going to go into captivity, and with that you've killed with the sword, you're definitely going to be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Right now, the elect of the nation of Israel, the 144,000 and the rest of the righteous 1/3, having the patience and the faith, diligently waiting for our power to save us and set us up so we can finally get the big payback on you heathen nations, chiefly you Edomites. Hey, and there can be no peace talks or reconciliation. Blood must be shed to make right everything that was wrong. This is Numbers 35, verse 33. So ye shall not pollute the land wherein ye are, for blood, it defileth the land. And the land of America and wherever else the Israelites have dwelt has definitely been defiled by their blood shed by the Edomites. And the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it. Point blank, period. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity, and he that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Hey, and this cleansing is going to begin when these nuclear missiles are shot to the ends of the earth and hit everywhere you Edomites dwell. America alone is going to get hit with 200 million nuclear warheads and turned into the biblical lake of fire from sea to shining sea, and then a desolate, uninhabitable wasteland afterwards. And you Edomites that survive, beginning with the elites of the Edomites, like the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, DuPonts, Gettys, Merovingians, you name it, are going to be the first fruits of slaves in the kingdom of heaven. And you Edomites that died on this side are going to be reborn through their loins and go straight into captivity for 1,000 years of payback and building up the kingdom of heaven. And hey, we're not going to give it to you easy. As it says in Revelation 18, we're going to do double unto you as you did unto us, but it's going to be in righteousness. We're not going to rape a man's family in front of his eyes. But don't think that just because we're not going to get as dirty as you did, that we're going to go easy on you. Here's an example of some of the things that's going to happen to you Edomites in the kingdom. Hey, like you abused those Gadite children by sending them to those re-education camps, and a lot of them died off. Hey, your children aren't going to go through it any easier in the kingdom of heaven, nor are your women or your old, your men, etc., etc. This is Psalms 137, verses 7-9. Remember, O Yahweh, the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, even to the foundation thereof. And this was talking about back in the past, when the Edomites helped the Babylonians to take down the southern kingdom. But hey, it can go all the way up until today. You Edomites have taken glee in saying to the children of Israel, raise it, even to the foundation thereof, taking the southern kingdom from the west coast of Africa to the Americas for slavery and stripping their identities from them and giving them bastard Edomite Christianity while you raped, robbed, and murdered them all the way up until this very day, and doing the same thing to the northern kingdom, the so-called Native Americans and Latinos, colonizing and taking away their lands, rape, robbing, and abusing them all the way from the past all the way up until today, not acknowledging that they're Israelites, but calling them these bywords indigenous peoples, Native Americans, Mexican, Spic, Tonto, Latino, nigger, African American, the list goes on and on. O daughter of Babylon, who art to be destroyed, happy shall he be that rewarded thee, as thou hast served us. Do unto them double, as thou hast done unto us. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity, and he that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. The land cannot be cleansed of the blood that was shed in it, but by the blood of them that shed it. Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones. There's accounts of those Spanish Edomite conquistadors cutting out a pregnant so-called Latino woman's child out of their stomach. There are accounts of, with the Southern Kingdom, their children being fed to alligators, as well as those children being buried up to their neck in dirt while Edomites saw who could kick the baby's head off. The list goes on and on. You're going to receive that in the kingdom of heaven, but double. So to you Edomites out there that may come across this video, you better enjoy the last seconds of this kingdom of yours, because that's the last bit of reprieve you're going to get. Once you go into slavery to serve in that first 1,000 years of the kingdom of heaven, it's going to be hell to tell the captain until the end of that 1,000 years, when all you Edomite men, women, and children will be gathered up and permanently culled from this planet with fire. So that's it with this video. And with this video, I hope you sincere Akim were edified. Just keep strong and keep pushing this word. We're almost out of this final wicked captivity of the heathen nations, chiefly of the Edomites. And as always, I'm going to say Abad Babal, Kwam Yasharala, and until next time, Shalom.